When Aaron and Daniel Whitmore left the city for the countryside, they expected peace, space, and a new chapter for their growing family, which at that time included only the two of them and a clumsy, bright-eyed Labrador puppy named Scout. The house they chose sat on the edge of a pine-draped valley, hugged by rolling hills and backed by a whispering forest that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The property had a bit of everything: an old garden that needed love, a half-forgotten greenhouse, and a pool that had seen better days but shimmered with promise under the sun. The first few weeks were about settling in. Scout took to the new space with relentless energy, galloping across the lawn, chewing everything he could get his teeth on, and barking at every squirrel with enthusiasm that bordered on delusion. Aaron, a nature photographer, spent most mornings crouched near the edge of the woods, listening, watching, hoping. Daniel, a software developer who now worked remotely, found solace in hammering away at small repairs, patching fence lines, restoring old sheds, and discovering all the quirks of the aging home. Then came the tracks. Aaron noticed them first, pale impressions in the muddy edge of the garden bed. Larger than a house cat, lighter than a coyote. She knew the difference instantly. "Bobcat," she murmured, brushing her fingers across the imprint. Over the next few days, the signs grew more frequent. A tuft of fur caught on the low fence, a pair of golden eyes peering from the tree line at dusk, a fleeting silhouette darting across the gravel drive one misty morning. Scout was the first to approach him. It was a quiet afternoon in early March, and Aaron was trimming dead lavender near the greenhouse. Scout, never far from her side, suddenly froze. Across the yard, barely 10 feet from the fence, sat a young bobcat. Lean, long-legged, his ears tufted like miniature horns. He didn't move, just stared. Scout let out a confused bark, then another, but stayed rooted. To Aaron's surprise, the bobcat didn't run. Instead, he gave a slow blink, an almost feline sign of acknowledgement, and retreated, silent as wind. She started leaving out food, not every night, just enough to show he was welcome. Not tamed, not trapped, just seen. Over time, the bobcat returned more frequently. He lingered longer. Aaron began calling him Ash for the pale dusting on his coat that reminded her of the burnt tree stumps she once photographed in Yellowstone. Daniel was skeptical at first. "You can't befriend a bobcat," he warned. "It's not a pet." Aaron agreed, but that wasn't the goal. Ash was never fenced in. He came on his own, and he left on his own. But something began shifting between him and Scout. It began with long-distance games. Scout would bound across the lawn, dropping to a playful crouch. Ash, from the other side of the garden fence, would mirror the motion. Over the following weeks, their curiosity grew bolder. Scout would carry sticks over and drop them near Ash's usual watching spot. Ash, in turn, left feathers or bones, gifts from his nightly hunts, beside the porch. The day they touched noses for the first time, Aaron held her breath so hard she forgot to exhale. It was dawn, the yard bathed in gold. Scout trotted up to the edge of the garden where Ash stood, unusually still. There was a pause, a moment that felt like a test of trust written in animal code, and then gently, they reached toward one another. It was the start of something extraordinary. Daniel eventually softened too. He built a stronger perimeter around the pool, reinforced the garden gate, and kept a respectful distance from Ash. "He's wild," he'd still say. "He doesn't belong to us." But Aaron would smile. "Maybe," she'd reply, "but he seems to have chosen us anyway." Scout and Ash became inseparable. They played like brothers, wrestling, tumbling, chasing each other through the tall grass. Aaron sometimes caught Ash resting in the shade, while Scout napped beside him, one paw over the other, as if mimicking the bobcat's elegant stillness. On cold evenings, she'd spot them pressed together near the porch heater. Two creatures that, by all logic, should have been enemies, yet radiated the comfort of old friends. Ash never lost his wildness. He still disappeared into the woods for hours, sometimes days, returning with burrs in his fur or traces of blood on his paws. He never let anyone but Scout touch him, and yet, he stayed. He always came back. Neighbors were skeptical. One even warned Aaron that Ash could turn dangerous, that bobcats weren't meant to be near humans. But Aaron watched the way he moved, the caution in his steps, the reverence he had for boundaries. He never entered the house, never took food unless it was placed quietly and without expectation. He was wild, but he was loyal. The Whitmores didn't try to own him, they simply made space. And in that quiet, open space, a puppy and a predator built something that most people wouldn't believe if they hadn't seen it with their own eyes. By the time spring painted the valley green, their story had already begun unfolding in a way none of them could have predicted. The bobcat had become part of the rhythm of their lives, and Scout, once just a bouncing blur of fur, now carried a calmness shaped by his unlikely friend. But as the days grew longer and Scout's curiosity expanded toward the pool, none of them knew that their bond would soon be tested in the most unexpected and dangerous way possible. But as the days grew longer and Scout's curiosity expanded toward the pool, none of them knew that their bond would soon be tested in the most unexpected and dangerous way possible. The pool had always been Scout's favorite mystery. At first, he'd simply circle it, nose twitching, drawn by the odd shimmer of water. He'd paw at the edge, bark at his own reflection, and then bolt away as if startled by the ripples he'd created. Aaron found it charming, even filmed him once chasing a floating leaf across the surface. But they'd never formally introduced him to swimming. It was something they assumed they'd get to, someday. That day never came. Not before the accident. It was a soft morning in late May. Sunlight streamed through the trees, scattering gold across the lawn. Daniel was inside on a work call, headphones on, lost in some tech speak that muffled the world. Aaron was down the path, repotting seedlings in the greenhouse. Scout was on the patio, lounging in the shade, Ash nearby on his usual perch by the garden steps. Everything was calm until the splash. The sound was sharp, sudden, wrong. It cracked across the quiet like a shout. Erin's hands froze in the soil. Her heart skipped. She turned instinctively, and what she saw chilled her blood. Scout was in the pool, struggling, not paddling, not swimming, struggling. His paws flailed against the water. His mouth opened and closed, gasping. He couldn't find the steps. The panic in his eyes was unmistakable, primal. The pool was deeper than it looked in the center, and he had somehow gone right in. "Scout!" Erin's voice ripped through the air as she sprinted toward him, her boots slipping in the dew-slicked grass. But she wasn't the first to move. Ash was already there. The bobcat had leapt from his perch the instant Scout went under. Aaron saw it in fragments, like a dream moving too fast. Ash standing at the pool's edge, tail twitching violently, his body coiled, trembling with a wild internal battle. Ash hated water. She knew that. He'd never step near it, always backing away even from puddles after a rainstorm. His fear of water was deep, instinctual, wired into him by generations of predators who avoided drowning at all costs. But then, he jumped. It was not graceful, not like his usual movements, which were quiet and liquid. This was clumsy, explosive, a blur of fur and claws, legs extended as if trying to defy what he was about to hit. The splash was violent. Ash flailed for a second, clearly overwhelmed by the shock, but he didn't retreat. He turned his head toward Scout, pushed through the water like he was wrestling a monster made of liquid. He reached Scout with sheer will. Aaron reached the edge just as Ash was using his head and shoulders to nudge the floundering dog toward the shallow end. Scout's paws connected with the submerged steps, and he scrambled up, coughing and shaking. Ash clambered out a moment later, soaked, panting, and shivering. The two animals collapsed on the stone edge, side by side, soaked and silent. Aaron dropped to her knees beside them, one arm wrapping Scout in a trembling hug, the other hesitating just inches from Ash. She didn't want to frighten him, but Ash didn't move away. His eyes, usually so sharp and alert, were tired now, calm. For 1 second, he let her fingers brush his shoulder. Daniel came running seconds later, his face frozen in confusion at the scene. Scout pressed into Aaron's lap, still wheezing but safe. Ash simply lay still, staring at the water like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. That night, the house was silent. No dinner clatter, no TV, no music, just the hum of the ceiling fan and the weight of realization. Daniel paced the hallway, guilt written on every line of his face. "I never finished that section of the pool fence," he finally said aloud, breaking the quiet. I thought I'd get to it after the weekend." He didn't wait for judgment. Instead, he grabbed his toolbox and a flashlight and went outside. He didn't come back in until well past midnight. The broken fence was not only fixed, it was doubled in strength. Every inch of the pool perimeter was now lined with motion sensors, a custom-built gate, and 2 new surveillance cameras Daniel installed himself. Inside, Scout was wrapped in a towel, snoring softly beside the fireplace. Ash was there too, curled up near the hearth, still damp, his breathing slow. He hadn't returned to the woods. Not that night. He stayed. And in the stillness of that living room, Erin realized something she couldn't put into words at the time, something that would only become clear in the days to come. Ash hadn't just saved Scout. He had overcome something so deeply embedded in his nature, so antithetical to his survival instincts, that it bordered on miraculous. He had made a choice, a conscious, sacrificial decision, all for his unlikely friend. Ash hadn't just saved Scout. He had overcome something so deeply embedded in his nature, so antithetical to his survival instincts, that it bordered on miraculous. He had made a choice, a conscious, sacrificial decision, all for his unlikely friend. In the morning, Erin woke early. The house was still dark, touched only by the faint blue hue of pre-dawn light. She stepped into the living room barefoot, expecting the cold silence of the previous night. Instead, she found Ash curled tightly beside Scout on the rug, their bodies rising and falling in tandem. Scout's paw was draped across Ash's flank. Ash didn't move. His ears twitched, but his body remained still and trusting, breathing the same rhythm as the dog beside him. It felt sacred, untouchable. Daniel emerged a few minutes later, coffee in hand, his expression softer than usual. He stood beside Erin at the threshold of the room and said nothing for a long while. Then, in a quiet voice, he muttered, "He doesn't belong out there anymore." Erin looked at him, surprised. "You mean the woods?" "I mean—" Daniel hesitated. "He still belongs to the wild, but not only to it, not after this." They didn't discuss it further. The decision felt mutual, inevitable. That day they began rearranging the house, not to contain Ash, but to welcome him. Daniel spent the weekend building what he called the passage. It was a discreet wooden door in the back mudroom that led out to the garden, designed specifically for Ash. It could be locked from inside when needed, but otherwise remained open. There was no enclosure, no traps, no collar, just an open pathway, a silent agreement. Ash used it cautiously at first. He would disappear into the trees in the late evening, his silhouette melting into the shadows as he resumed his nocturnal rituals. But, like clockwork, he returned before dawn, slipping back inside to find Scout. Sometimes he brought gifts, twigs, feathers, once even a lopsided rabbit skull. Erin didn't understand the logic, but it felt ceremonial, like Ash was honoring the bond he had risked his life for. Scout, on the other hand, had changed. The once rambunctious puppy now followed Ash with a reverence that bordered on worship. He still played, still chased butterflies and barked at bees. But there was something else now, an awareness. He watched the Bobcat's every move and mimicked his quiet patience. If Ash sat by the window, Scout did too. If Ash stalked slowly through the tall grass, Scout crept behind him, tail wagging low and steady. The trust between them had deepened. It was no longer play. It was loyalty. One night, thunder rolled in without warning. The wind rose with a howl, tossing branches and rattling the gutters. Scout, who had never experienced a full-blown storm, began to whimper and pace. His usual bravery abandoned him as lightning danced outside the glass. Then Ash entered the room. Without a sound, he leapt onto the couch where Scout trembled. He didn't cuddle or purr or lick. He simply sat, back straight, yellow eyes calm, the storm reflected in his pupils. Scout watched him, breathing fast. After a moment, he slowly crawled toward Ash and rested his head against the Bobcat's chest. They stayed like that the entire night. After that, something shifted in how even Erin and Daniel saw Ash. He was no longer the wild visitor. He was no longer the rescued outsider. He was part of their world. Not a pet, but something closer to kin. Ash never allowed himself to be picked up. He refused to be touched unless he initiated it. Yet when Erin sat reading by the fireplace, he would sometimes leap beside her and settle at arm's length, his presence a quiet affirmation of trust. There was one moment, though, that stayed with her more than any other. She was watching old footage on her camera one evening, replaying the pool incident, which she had accidentally caught through the garden camera mounted nearby. The image was grainy, the angle distant, but everything was there: the splash, the chaos, and the unbelievable act that followed. Daniel sat beside her, stunned. He squeezed her hand as the video played again and again. "He chose fear," Erin whispered. "He chose it so he could overcome it." Daniel nodded. And he didn't hesitate. Later that night, she wrote in her journal, "Ash didn't save Scout because he had to. He didn't act from instinct. He acted from something else, something deeper. It wasn't wildness. It wasn't domestication. It was love." They began calling the day of the, not in panic, but in pause, like a thread had been cut. A bark would follow, sharp and short. And moments later, Ash would appear silently from behind a tree or a boulder, his tail twitching once as if to say, "I was never far." Erin filmed one of these moments. She hadn't meant to, was just testing a new handheld camera, but the footage was haunting in its quiet beauty. Scout, standing still beneath a grove of tall aspens, ears high, body alert. Then, out of frame, the sound of a single rustle. Ash entered the scene like a shadow sliding into form. Scout immediately lowered his head and wagged once, the relief visible in his stance. No words, no commands, just understanding. When she showed the clip to Daniel, he watched it 3 times in silence. Finally, he said, "That's what trust looks like when no one's pretending." By mid-October, the nights were sharp and frost-kissed. Scout had fully healed from his injury, and Ash seemed more comfortable in the house than ever. He even began sleeping on the living room armchair, a place once reserved only for humans. Erin didn't move him. She simply added a folded blanket on top. One morning, just as the first snow threatened the sky, she found them curled there together. Scout sprawled across Ash like a child on an older sibling. Ash's paw rested gently across Scout's shoulder. It looked like they'd fallen asleep mid-conversation. That image stayed with her all day. That night, she wrote in her journal, "We try to draw lines between wild and tame, between instinct and emotion. But Ash and Scout remind me that love doesn't ask permission. It finds a way. Even across species. Even across fear." The first snowfall came quietly. The world turned white overnight, blanketing the woods and softening the edges of every fence, tree branch, and rooftop. Erin awoke to the hush of it, the kind of silence that only snow can bring, and pulled aside the curtain to see the garden transformed. And there they were. Scout and Ash lay together under the old cedar, their shapes nestled in the shallow drift. Ash's breath came out in steady white puffs, while Scout's nose peeked just above the snow, wagging gently in his sleep. The storm had come, and they had chosen to meet it together. That day marked 1 year since Rescue Day. It hadn't been planned, but somehow Erin and Daniel found themselves marking the occasion. They cooked a special breakfast, Scout's bowl filled with his favorite boiled chicken and carrots, and for Ash, a careful plate of fresh quail meat. They didn't know if the Bobcat would accept it, but they placed it anyway, near the warm hearth where he often sat. He came in an hour later, snow still clinging to his back like glitter, and ate every bite without hesitation. That night, Erin lit a candle on the windowsill. It was something her mother used to do in winter, an old tradition meant to guide loved ones home. She hadn't done it in years, but as the flame flickered against the darkening woods, she felt a sense of completion, as if this home was no longer temporary, as if it had taken this year, these 2 animals, to make the place real. Later, Scout curled up near the fire, already dozing. Ash jumped silently onto the couch and sat close, not touching, just nearby. Erin joined them and opened her journal for the final time that season. "A home isn't made of walls," she wrote. "It's made of moments like these, where fear is overcome by love, where the wild comes in from the cold, not because it was tamed, but because it was trusted." In the months that followed, the rhythm of life deepened. Ash continued his nightly visits to the forest, yet his pattern had shifted. He returned earlier, lingered longer, and Scout, more confident now, stronger, had found his stride. He no longer panicked at separation, but he always waited at the back door for Ash's return. Always. One night, in early March, a thunderstorm struck, the kind that seemed to shake the bones of the house. Erin was startled awake by the crash of lightning. She hurried to check on Scout, who was usually fearful of loud storms, but she found him fast asleep. And there, beside him, was Ash, stretched long and calm, eyes half closed, tail flicking slowly. Rain lashed the windows, wind howled, but inside was peace. That image, the bobcat and the dog, lying side by side as the storm raged outside, became etched in Aaron's memory as a symbol of everything they'd become. Not just companions, not even just survivors, but family. When spring finally arrived, bringing fresh blossoms and soft mud trails, Scout and Ash resumed their daily patrols of the garden. They moved like scouts themselves, alert, playful, silent when needed. Ash would stalk the edge of the fence, then leap with impossible grace onto the garden wall. Scout would bark from below, tail wagging, daring him to come down and chase. Sometimes he did. Other times he merely stared, daring Scout to follow. And follow he did. One afternoon in April, Daniel found Aaron sitting by the pond, notebook open in her lap but untouched. She wasn't writing, just watching. Across the water, Scout and Ash were rolling in the long grass, a quiet ballet of fur and limbs and laughter. There were no commands, no games invented by humans. Just two souls who had chosen one another again and again, in moments that couldn't be scripted. You know, Daniel said, sitting beside her, if someone told me a year ago I'd share my house with a bobcat, I'd have laughed in their face. Aaron smiled, and if someone told me he'd be the one to save our dog, I would have said they were dreaming. He took her hand. But dreams are just truths we haven't lived yet. They watched the two play until dusk fell, and then headed inside, the golden hour brushing the world in light. That night, Scout jumped into bed with them, something he hadn't done since he was a pup. He sprawled across their feet with a groan, satisfied. Moments later, Ash appeared in the doorway. He didn't ask permission. He just leapt onto the foot of the bed and curled up beside Scout. No one moved. The room was quiet except for breathing, human and animal, and the occasional flick of Ash's ear. It was a perfect silent affirmation. We are safe. We are together. We are home. Aaron didn't write that night. She simply watched the moonlight stretch across the floorboards and thought about everything they had learned. That trust can't be forced, but it can be earned. That fear doesn't always keep us alive. Sometimes love does. And that sometimes, if we're lucky, the wild finds its way to us not to be tamed, but to remind us how to be brave. Scout found a protector in the most unlikely creature. Ash found a home where love asked nothing of him but presence. And together, they taught us that family isn't who you're born to. It's who you'd leap into the water for.